Thank you. Probably if you listen to the last panel, you realize that it's not easy to distinguish the different issues clearly. It's now not about the limits of understanding, but the limits of narration. You see, I prefer to speak German, not to keep the interpreters busy, but to make the problem of translation of language visible. With Karl Malantes, I have somebody here who is experienced in war, who fought for 13 months in the Vietnam War, and he went there in the year I was born, in 1968, and who recently published a novel on this. And Lawrence Weschler has worked for more than 20 years for The New Yorker, and in this context, among many other things, he published a lot of reports on the legal coming to terms with crimes of war. Both, in a very different way, have dealt with the question, how is it possible that warriors and civilians come to peace after the war? And in their work, they have reflected or focused on the process of learning, which is linked to the fact to be able to tell the stories and having to tell the story. And I would like to start with Karl Malantes, because what I found very astonishing when I read his two books were the years when they were published. In 2010, 2011, 2010, his book Matterhorn, a novel of the Vietnam War, was published, and in 2011, the book Atlantic War. And since you've returned from the Vietnam War, for more than 40 years, you have written and worked on these novels. It's probably one of the latest books that was published on the Vietnam War. And I would like to know, why so long? Why has taken you almost 40 years? Was it due to the fact that you had the impression only now you have come to terms with the story you wanted to tell? Or did you have the feeling you have to repeat or correct your own narration because time is working against you? And as there were also other wars led by America, so to be able to publish your book, you had to change your narration again and again.
Well, actually, it's a very simple answer, is that no publisher wanted to publish it.
It's a complex answer.
It's right. Okay. I'll get into the details, but in a way, that was sort of a gift to me, because it hadn't been published when I first tried to get it published, which was 1978. It wasn't nearly half the novel that it not in terms of size, that it ended up being, because I got older and wiser, and as you were saying, I started to come to terms with things that I couldn't come or didn't come to terms with when I was in my 20s. I came back from the war, and I was at Oxford, and I took one summer and I said, well, I'm going to write this great novel about the Vietnam War. So I sat down with a typewriter. Some of you might know what that is. And I just went, for several months, and I stacked up 1,700 pages of first-person, what I thought was fiction writing. And I said, this is simple. God, novels are easy. Just spit them out, right? And I went away with my girlfriend for about a month, and I came back and I read it. It was just crap. It was just terrible. But what did it sort of fixed in my mind a lot of details. So then I got a book, and I started to read how do you develop characters, how do you develop plot. And I found out fiction writing isn't easy, and then I finally got it down to about a 900-page manuscript, and it was just amazing. No one would read it. And you have to understand, I mean, part of the problem with fiction writing is that you have to get publishers who are willing to publish it, and publishers need to send their kids to school and straighten their teeth just like writers do. And so they have to guess whether or not they can sell it. And it's a big book, and I don't know if it's the same in Germany, but in America, 85% of the fiction readers are women. And so publisher goes like, it's a war book, and this is, they're not going to even look at the cover. And so and I kept working on it, and I would write letter after letter. I could apparently write novels, but not query letters.
Darf ich eine Zwischenfrage stellen? Weil ich jetzt
May I interrupt you? I was quite surprised you
sein Buch auf den Okay, I'll wait till you get your headphones. Ich bin jetzt verdutzt.
I was really surprised that you're reporting for or talking about, out of a perspective of a businessman, of an author who wants to sell his book as fast as possible on the market. Because one of the premises of this panel was that a lot of soldiers come back from the war and are unable to tell the story. That is just the contrary of what you've told us. You wanted to write. It was a flow of writing, and you did it, and you wrote pages after pages, maybe not to forget anything. Wasn't that the problem, that you were unable of telling your story? Or did you rather have the desire to share everything you experience with the public?
There's a couple of things that go on there. I had a need to try and get some ghosts out. Ghosts haunt you. And if you can get them, there's a man named Joseph Bobro who says the process is turning ghosts into ancestors. And that was just a personal need. I mean, I had no idea whether I would ever sell it, but I just had to sort of just get it out because I had just an enormous amount. I mean,
was that different than your fellow people in your troops, in your Marine squad, for example? Were you unusual in that way, or?
I think I might be unusual that way because I had always wanted to be a writer. That's a very big difference. Ever since I was this big, I wanted to be a writer, and this was like a fairly big topic. I think that part of the problem with people talking about their war experiences, and it is that the veteran is never sure how it's going to be received. You do terrible things in wars, and if you really want to talk honestly about them, you'll kill any dinner table conversation instantly, if you're really going to be honest. And culture, I think it's probably the same in Europe, certainly in America, you're not allowed to brag. Bragging is bad, all right? And you're certainly not allowed to whine or complain. And since war is about 95% things to complain about and maybe 3% things to brag about, it leaves you tiny little pieces to talk about. I remember my father, who was a World War II veteran, and my uncles and their friends. He fought in France, and he fought in Belgium and Germany, and what they would talk about is, oh, remember when we got drunk on Calvados? Oh yeah, that was great. And that was the World War II narrative that I heard. Not a single word about combat, because in the culture you don't whine and complain, and you don't brag. So what are you left with? It's funny stories, and I think that's a major thing. So it's like it's a dual situation. The veteran is worried that he's going to be judged, and also veterans often don't want to bring it up because you spend a lot of your time just shoving it down so you can get your jobs done. You got to raise families. You got to do so just hold that down. But the audience doesn't want to hear it either, because it's just our culture. We don't do that.
Who were you writing for?
I think, as I said in the beginning, I was just writing to just get it out and tell the story. But what kept me motivated is a good question, because I had to be working on this book for 30 years, and it was very simple. When I came back from Vietnam, I was still in the Marine Corps, and I was working at the Pentagon, and I had to go to the White House and had some, information I had to carry over there. I was in my uniform, and a bunch of protesters were on the other side of the street, and they were calling me dirty names, and they were flipping me the bird, and they were shouting baby killer, and I was on the other side of the street, and I was thinking, the people you're calling baby killers are probably 3 years younger than you are, because the average age in my company was about 19. That's the average. And I was the oldest one in the company. I turned 23 out of 200 Marines. So, but that's an aside. But you can see it's a difficult thing. I mean, kids themselves are usually inarticulate, so they're very young. But anyway, I couldn't say anything to them. I mean, if I had walked across the street, it would have been, hell would have broken loose. And I couldn't shout across the street. And I just wanted, what kept me going is that I just want to tell you that we're just people in here. I mean, Marines, you have this image of Marines, but it's a 19-year-old kid in a uniform, ultimately. And I just wanted to say, well, this is what it's like. Here's what it's like to be 19 and try to grow up in a war. And that's what
you were also saying on the bus about the rifle.
Well, yeah, right. This is, thank you. It goes back to this thing about the alienation between the veteran who feels uncomfortable talking to the, I don't know what you call them, civilians. My analogy to that is that you have a rifle. The rifle is paid for by every taxpayer in the country. It is designed by scientists who are trained by school teachers, who are fed by farmers. And at the end of this long interrelated chain that makes this rifle, some 19-year-old pulls the trigger. But we want to say that he did the killing. He did the killing, not we did the killing. I mean, no one's clean. I mean, the only way you're going to be clean is to leave the country, not have a car, move to, I don't know where, Nepal. Nobody's clean. But we like to pretend that we are. And whether you were for the war or against the war, the kid still carries the burden. Because if you're for the war, it's like, go get 'em, boy, patriotism, we'll love you, doing your duty. Or the other side of it is like, well, I didn't vote for that damn war, I don't have anything to do with it. You did that killing all on your own. Either way, the kid is left with the whole burden. And so how does he feel about talking to people? Doesn't feel like it.
Hat es Ihnen geholfen, dass in der Zwischenzeit... sorry.
Has it been helpful that in the meantime, other books and films were published and produced on the war in Vietnam? Has it changed your perspective, or has it taken away possibilities from you because some books or films were better, you thought, or in your book you had to focus on something different, maybe?
No, I get asked that a lot. I never much cared about what other people wrote about the war. I just wanted to tell, like I said, I want to tell our story, my story and my friends. And that is unique to me. Nobody could never take that away, no matter what they do. I mean, if you're doing commercial fiction, then you have to worry about it. And I wasn't doing commercial fiction. There's a very big difference. I mean, commercial fiction writers, I laud them. I mean, you try and keep people turning pages. It's very difficult work. So I don't put down commercial fiction writers, but it's a different game. They are always having to have an eye on the market. Has this been done? Is this going to look old hat? But if you're writing from the heart and you're writing literature, which is you're trying to get somebody engaged in a character so that they expand their life, not by reading about you or what you're saying, but by identifying and seeing the world through somebody else's eyes. That is what literature is about. Commercial fiction is not about that. It's a very different game. So if you're being true, there's no need to worry. No one's going to have my story.
Another important point is that the United States, in contrast to Germany, has almost constantly in war over the last decades, different wars. And that was something I found very striking when I read your book. And how far have you had the feeling over the years that this focus on Vietnam you had to justify because there has been the war in Iraq and the 9/11, the attacks on the Twin Towers. We will come back to this when we'll talk about an article by Longson. How can you defend your subject in a history with more and more wars luring attention? And was there a need to justify why you wrote this old story?
Well, again, I'm not trying to write a novel about the Vietnam War. I'm trying to write about what it is like to be 19 and in a war. And I took that particular war because it's the only one I know. Historians need to think about putting it in context with the wars that came afterwards. And, you know, academics need to think about things like that. But as far as I'm concerned, fiction writers, that's not their job. Their job is simply to try to explain something about the human experience that will help other people expand their idea of the human experience. And war has been with us for millennium. I mean, 50,000 years we've been doing this. And it is a huge part of the human experience. But increasingly, it's becoming more, fewer and fewer people participate in it. And so that's...
Sie thematisieren ja, und das ist zugleich eine Brücke zu dem...
Your issue, and which brings me to the article by Lawrence Wisher, in your second book, you focus on the shift of wars which are fought by drones, and where also those who are in war do not have a direct contact, or their contact with the enemy is filtered through the media, and so it's done in a very indirect way, or due to the technology of war, to avoid that a war is different, real war is different from a computer game, for example. And I would like to come to you. You said you wanted to read the article Modern Times, and this is an article on which you focused and put it into context with Desert Storm in the war in Iraq.
Yeah, before, there was a little part I wanted to read here, but I want to respond to something you said, which is about that image of the rifle. And it's the challenge, it has been the challenge of my life in this kind of writing, which is that if you live in the United States, you are living in a democracy, and you are responsible for this stuff. There was a moment in the conversation earlier where, you know, there was a thing, is it harder to know the truth in an authoritarian regime than in a democracy? It is much, much, much harder to know what's going on in the world if you live in the United States than if you lived, for example, my wife, who is Polish, grew up under communism. When she came to the United States in 1983, she could not believe how uninformed people were. When you live in an authoritarian country like Poland, she would say, you know, you knew how to read the newspaper. Right. And we in America are systematically taught, we are underdeveloped the way that, you know, one used to say that Cuba was underdeveloped. We are underdeveloped in how to read the newspaper. And one of the things that happens in any war in the United States is that the media immediately have to join the war effort, otherwise they're accused of being traitors. So there's this nonstop drum roll, you know, and it's very hard. And people just aren't paying attention. The way that most people act is that it has nothing to do with them. And so my efforts over the years in all sorts of things, we can talk other examples in a few minutes, has been how do you get people to understand that this is them, they are responsible for it, and so forth. And this one piece that I thought might be useful to read actually goes back to the first Gulf War. And it's interesting in this context about narrating war because I'm going to give you a little story here that happened at the very beginning of the first Gulf War. And you'll find me talking about all this newfangled equipment. And it's amazing to realize that when Bush 1 launched the first Gulf War, there was no web. And this stuff, it was like that week this stuff had come online, some stuff that was like the web. But anyway, I'll read this. It's from a piece called Modern Times. Published in 1991. The morning after the launching of Desert Storm, a group of us at my office were talking about this awesome new thing that has entered the world. These awesome new things, this unprecedented kind of warfare with its truly precision, pinpoint aerial bombing. This unprecedented kind of war where, thanks to the various satellite technologies, you get to hear the results of that bombing instantaneously. As it's happening. Modern, we said, high-tech, uncanny, eerie, futuristic. And yet, of course, at another level, there's nothing new here. On the ground, the carnage of war, the gore, the frantically desperate attempts at rescue, the bitterly expiring hopes, they're all the same as they've ever been. One of my friends there at the office that day commented on the way he'd been haunted all morning by the memory of an article he'd read last year. He couldn't remember where, about the San Francisco earthquake, about this young couple who'd been buried alive together in a small room in their collapsed apartment, their bones crushed in debris up to their waists, the two of them huddled together in this narrow air pocket, and of how the rescuers finally got to them, but at that very moment the wreckage caught fire. They were able to free up the husband, but he was forced to leave his wife behind, and she perished in the flames. We were all silent for a moment. CNN in the background was cross-cutting between the latest Pentagon briefing and live coverage of a speech by the Turkish Prime Minister in Ankara. Wait a second, my friend said. I remember, it was in the Whole Earth Review. In fact, I bet we can access it over Nexus. In those days, we had Nexus and Lexus and all these things. Our office is tied into one of those computerized databases, which offers continuously updated access to the complete back contents of hundreds of newspapers and periodicals. This was amazing in 1991. My friend set himself down before the system's console, revved up the machine, punched in a few keywords, earthquake and fire and rescue and couple, and instantaneously that very article appeared on the screen. He punched a few more buttons and the console's neighboring printer revved up and began spewing out a copy. The whole process didn't take more than a few moments. The account by Stuart Brand was every bit as compelling as our colleague had remembered it. It turned out that Brand himself had happened to be visiting the neighborhood at the moment the earthquake struck, and that he'd played an impromptu part in the volunteer rescue attempts. He'd been one of those on the outside scrambling through the wreckage. Of course, it wasn't as direct and purposeful as this brief account makes it seem, he records. A real rescue is dreamy and hesitant, full of false starts and conflicting ideas, at times frantic and focused, at times diffuse. It's a self-organizing process, neither quick nor tidy. Much later, weeks after the disaster, he'd gone back and interviewed several of the principals from the evening's incident, including Bill Ray, the husband, who was still recovering at a hospital. In his article, Brand interwove their stories, and his account climaxed as the firemen were being driven back by the flames. I told Janet, this is Ray talking, I told her, I'm going to get free, and we're both going to get free. I assumed that I was binding her, and that if I could get loose, then she could get loose. You just start pulling up with everything you've got. You reach up and you pull on the lathe and the plaster, and it's breaking off in your hand. Janet was screaming because it was a lot of pain, and her arms were trapped, and a picture frame of glass was cutting her. Then I got free, but she still wasn't, and I tried to pull her out. Smoke was coming in. You could hear the flames crackling and popping. She couldn't pull herself loose, and I couldn't get to her. What they said to each other then, Bill Ray prefers to keep private. Then I left, Ray recalls. I crawled out of that hole, and so forth. That terrible lacuna, the private moment, what they possibly could have said to each other, has haunted me too ever since I read it. And of course, I've been imagining the hundreds of variations of that scene being played out a half a globe away. The fact that accidental strikes on civilian targets are purportedly being kept to a minimum doesn't comfort me at all. I envision 17-year-old boys scrambling desperately to rescue their buddies, having to abandon the attempt to face further bombardments, and the image is in no way softened by the allegedly mitigating circumstance that the boys in question may be wearing uniforms. But strangely, the image that really haunts me, and the one I just can't shake, is that of my colleague in the eerie glow of his Nexus console, calmly punching that set of keys, activating the machine. The machine silently humming away, surveying the veritable continents of information before it, instantaneously quarrying its target, yanking it out of the endless field and delivering it up to us whole. The surgical precision of the whole process. For a moment that morning, my colleague's My colleague seemed to be like one of those amazing young officers strapped to his battle station aboard the AWACS control planes circling high above Saudi Arabia, coolly surveying his console, punching in the coordinates, splaying out the information, directing the entire battle. CNN, Nexus, AWACS, the web. They're all of a piece, and the carnage on the ground is something entirely else, almost infinitely removed. But the thing about that is, I'd say two things. First of all, the way in which the web today is another one of these things that seemingly pulls us closer, but in fact pulls us completely farther away. But also the way, and this is, you just have to say this over and over again to Americans if you're an American writer, this is your doing. You are, and I would say to you as one of the kids who was out there at the White House, but I would have felt this at the time, that this was our doing. And even if I didn't vote for it, I wasn't able to convince other people not to vote for it. And granted, we were facing an incredible media barrage. By the time you get to the 1972 election with Nixon, you're facing all the dirty tricks, you're facing any number of horrible things. But we weren't able to convince people, and in a democracy that makes it our responsibility. And it's our responsibility today, what's going on. And it's very, very hard to get people to focus. And so I'm always trying to find ways. And in this case, what is interesting, it's a fact of human nature. They can focus on a couple in San Francisco. They can't focus on a couple in Iraq.
Yeah. It's quite interesting, this sense of wanting to just keep your distance. And the internet is interesting because you would think it would make it all very real and very present. But you can go to the internet and get thousands of pictures of people shooting people in Iraq or Afghanistan or all over the world, Somalia. And they just choose a place and you can bring up picture after picture. And it becomes sort of meaningless. It becomes like, what's that? I mean, that's just another picture. There's no sense.
Also, the fact is that the key thing about the internet is you can push it and then you're out of it.
Right.
And the key thing about reality is you're not out of it.
Yeah,
you are in it.
Yeah.
In your case, for 13 months, you were in it. And I can visit you for 10 seconds, and when you get boring or a little bit too uncomfortable, I can just go away.
Yeah.
Right now, in Kiev, people are in it. They've been in it for 3 days. Yeah. I was there for 11 seconds this morning. Mm-hmm. That was fun.
Yeah.
I think that's an interesting point that you make, that it's not the question of access of information, but to make people feel concerned. No, that's okay. Okay.
I agree.
And this might mean to avoid talking about the war at all and
well, no, I mean, I
take
guess
a detour.
In my own case, I try to practice a kind of writerly nonfiction, which is as distinct from, and I have tremendous admiration for people who do daily journalism and so forth. But I'm constantly trying to find ways to insinuate myself into things that people will want to read about, and then you can kind of through the trapdoor get in. I mean, we were talking about a few of the examples. I did a piece some years ago about the head of the International Criminal Court, the head judge, Antonio Cassese, who began by just describing these horrible things that were coming across his desk every day, and I asked him how he kept from going crazy. And he said that as often as possible, he went to look at the Vermeers in the Mauritshuis there in The Hague. And I suddenly realized that when he said that, when Vermeer was painting those paintings, which are for us the very epitome of peace and centeredness, all of Europe was Bosnia. I mean, they were just coming out of the 30 Years' War, and that's what those paintings are about. They are about establishing a kind of intersubjectivity that goes beyond just the categories Catholic, Protestant, so forth and so on. And that there was an incredible moral invention happening there. In other cases, I wrote about Srebrenica from the point of view of Shakespeare, and how the Battle of Agincourt was exactly the same situation as it happened in Srebrenica. and then one thing that occurred to me, by the way, is in terms of the conversation earlier, one of the things that has completely bewildered me is precisely that moment that Peter was talking so eloquently about people who've been neighbors for years, whose kids have played, who grew up playing with other kids and so forth, and then suddenly the war arrives, and it's true that it arrives through other people, but once it's there, fear kicks in and so forth. And I was trying to figure out, what's going on, and I happened one day to be reading a report about a guy at the Santa Fe Institute, a scientist, who spent a lot of his time looking outside at the blackbirds on the playground at the kindergarten outside his window, and how they engaged in flocking behavior, and how you could do that. And he decided to try to do a computerized model of it, not using birds, but were called boids, robot boids, little specks. And he came up with like 3 very simple rules that if each of the specks on the computer followed those rules, they would self-organize into flocking behavior. And at that point, I tried to figure out if there were similar rules. And in my case, I came up with the fact, and I think one of the things that's very important in terms of the moment that Peter talks about, is that fear trumps hope. That people try to hope that it's not going to come to their village. They hope, but at a certain moment, fear is more powerful. And when that happens, when that failure of hope happens, it flips into hate. Because you have to justify why you are behaving the way you're behaving. And that in turn inspires more fear. So like 3 little steps and so forth. And then I suddenly realized that I was talking about the field of blackbirds, the Kosovo Polje, which is the place in 1389, it's called the Field of Blackbirds, where the entire Serbian myth of the nation keeps on all that keeps on rising from there. So anyway.
I get back to switch back to German. würde gerne
Right. I'd like to get back to the example which you used to add a different take. I mean, you focus very much on the American audience and that you can only interest them in wars conducted by the US themselves and wars taking place elsewhere, Yugoslavia, etc. That you can only interest them, the American audience, by using brazen metaphors. So bringing apparently discongruent things together and then setting up reflections and counter-reflections. Now, you mentioned Vermeer in Bosnia, but if you read this, you get a different impression. And that pertains to the special importance of the Criminal Court of Justice, i.e. the importance of an institution which corroborates narration in a very special function, i.e. using narration as an indictment of those who perpetrate or committed crimes against human rights. And in the Vermeer text, you got one message across very clearly, and that's something which offsets narration in a different way. And it's actually very tedious. The legalese is lost in lots of tedious elements. Lots of days are spent perusing details where you don't really know why it's important for the, indictment for the prosecutor. So I think the detour using Vermeer or using the Shakespeare battle or Aristotelian or Srebrenica. Hopefully I didn't confuse anything here. So I think these are just detours in order to kindle a process. Put a peg on a process as part of the article, which is very opaque for the witnesses in the process, in the criminal court tribunal.
It is interesting, by the way. I mean, a legal process is just another set of metaphors, and parenthetically, terribly flawed in all kinds of ways. But I mean, the trouble you have with legal is, no, that's not admissible. Yes, it is admissible. All these kinds of skirmishes and so forth, and indeed it becomes extremely boring when you're actually sitting there, which you feel terrible about at a certain point. Somebody is spilling their guts about what happened to them, and oh no, not another one. Somebody once made a comment to me that the point of all this stuff is to get it to the point where it bores everyone. and then maybe you can move on, but which is a very crass thing to say, but there's some truth to it. But the and I would put side by side with this daily reportage. I mean, the point is to get people around the world to listen, you know, and there's a certain amount of magic you have to do to get them to then listen to what in fact is the important thing, which is factual reportage. In my case, I hope in that piece I read you that you are curious about the situation of a 17-year-old Iraqi conscript, and you'll be open to listening to that and won't just immediately. The whole point about Vermeer, by the way, which is very interesting, is that in genre painting in Holland up till Vermeer, you know, you had people who stood in for symbols of drunkenness, of laziness, of industriousness, and they were all these iconographic genre. And what Vermeer kept undercutting that and saying, no, this is an actual person who is taking a nap in the middle of the day, who is pouring milk, who is looking at the mirror, holding up some pearls. This is not an image of vanity. This is a person in the fullness of their life. And what's fascinating with Vermeer is he's almost the first artist who's doing that. And the issue at the War Crimes Tribunal is to get you to the point where people just have to realize these were actual people who this happened to, and not a Turk or a Croat or a Serb. And that piece exactly consists in finding intersubjectivity. But in terms of the United States, coming back full circle, intersubjectivity is the hardest thing to get in the United States. To imagine that anyone outside of the United States is a person, let alone anybody in a red state or a blue state is a real person. I mean, everything in American media mitigates against that.
Well, it's the model is entertainment, isn't it? Mm-hmm. I mean, and that's why you have to hook people with something entertaining, and then maybe you can put the pill into their mouth later. It's sort of like put it in the orange juice. And I think that that's an interesting thing. I don't know if news was ever anything but entertainment, because I'm not a historian of journalism, but it certainly is about that now. And you're not going to be able to publish your articles to reach people unless you do it. And if you look at the way that CNN does the war. I mean, they do the Olympics exactly the same way. Dun, 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 day 17 of the war in Iraq. Dun, dun,
How did you feel when your father died? How did you feel?
That's right.
No, come on.
That's right.
Cry. You haven't started crying yet. Cry.
You just lost the bronze medal. Yeah, and you worked 18 years to get there. How do you feel? It's nonsense. I mean, it just makes you. But so we're dealing with really. I mean, it's just another aside, but. The difficulty of narrating war. When I left Seattle, I lived near Seattle, Washington. The headlines in the Seattle paper was snowfall near normal. Because we have hydroelectric
That was the
dams.
headline. Snowfall near normal. Banner headline.
That's
Breaking
right.
news.
It was a banner headline this big, because that meant that in the summer there would be water melting and the dams would continue to make electricity, which people that don't live in the Northwest don't know. And down here, literally, there were 4 lines in the bottom right-hand corner that said something was going on in the Ukraine.
Ukraine,
what are people,
not near normal.
Right, yeah, that's right. But I know what the editor is going. It says, what do people want to pick up and read? They don't even know where the Ukraine is, but they're really interested in the snowfall.
There's a famous expression that war is a way for Americans to learn geography.
Oh, dear.
Ich würde trotzdem ganz gerne von Vermeer in Bosnien.
Right. I mean, after Vermeer in Bosnia, I'd still like to go off on a different tangent. You got across very clearly that the legal accountability and, non-impunity is very important, because using the force of the law, they become human beings again, and they are given a face through the criminal process, through the crime process. At the crime tribunal. And this is also very important, because the question of war crimes was very important in the Vietnam War. It wasn't taken to court in international criminal courts. The US have still not ratified the Roman statutes, but nevertheless there were war tribunals who indicted war criminals in Vietnam. I'm putting this question deliberately because in the second book you refer to this. I wondered when I read this, is your book a book which gives law the ultimate, or it withdraws law's power to distinguish between punity and impunity, because you say you can't really draw a line because between the perpetrators and those. And actually, your book is a kind of correction of the kind of indictments which were taking place in war tribunals. Did that make sense?
Yeah, no, I think that what I was trying to say, and maybe it was my fault for not writing it very clearly, is that it's absolutely important that you have a law about atrocities. But what I was arguing is that you have to have the same attitude toward the people that commit atrocities as you have toward a dog with rabies. You don't hate the dog with rabies. You know that you must take the dog out of the neighborhood and put it down, but you don't hate it, because there, but for the grace of God, go I. And I have been in combat, and I understand the pressures that happen, and the woman that was just before us was saying that ordinary people end up not being able to stand up to these pressures. That does not excuse the law from prosecuting them, because if you don't have that discipline, then it's easier to do the atrocity. So you've got to have it, but you've got to prosecute them with some sense of there, but for the grace of God, go I. Because as soon as you flip into this, you're a son of a bitch, and you're a horrible perpetrator, and I'm an angel, all you're doing is perpetrating this human trait of you, them, you're not me, I'm, the stuff that we're talking about, suddenly, some force comes in, and suddenly, and now I'm a Serb, and you're a, whatever, and you're doing exactly the same thing when you're judging somebody like that, but you have to put him in jail.
I would phrase that slightly differently. I once wrote a piece about the artist Adrian Piper, who was a philosophy professor. In addition to being an artist, she does a lot of art she is a black woman and does art about difference and so forth. And she was giving a lecture about Kant. Immanuel Kant, and was talking about how his ethics were based on his epistemology, which is to say that the way he thought about how we believe things in different categories, a priori categories, was essential to understanding his ethics. And his ethics is basically the categorical imperative, which is basically the golden rule: treat others as you would have them, as you would be treated yourself. And she said that in terms of the epistemology, she said, if you lived in a world where your hand turned into a pigeon, you couldn't possibly develop an ethics, and that the entire ethics is based on that. And when she said that, I suddenly realized that in half of our lives, we do live in a world where our hand turns into a pigeon in our dream life. Mm-hmm. And the thing that's always amazing to me about dreams is that it doesn't wake you up. Oh yeah, sure, my hand just turned into a pigeon, that the kinds of things that happen in dream world aren't amazing. Oh yeah, sure, I just went and killed my neighbor. Oh yeah, And the point is that it seems to me that part of what happens in these horrible situations in Vietnam, in Bosnia, even in Kiev this afternoon, is that people are thrust into a dream world where things are just not, normal consequence isn't making sense. There are people who are completely in the dream world. There are people who have one foot in the dream world and one foot out of the dream world, and there are people who thrust everybody else into the dream world instrumentally. Milosevic was no Serb nationalist. He didn't care about Serb nationalism. He was a mid-level Communist Party bureaucrat who suddenly noticed that Serb nationalism was his meal ticket, that he could use it. Kissinger, or many of the people who sent you to Vietnam were manipulating other people into the dream world. And it seems to me that at the end of the day, the people who need to be held, everybody needs to take account of their own, what they did. There needs to be that kind of honesty among neighbors and so forth. But the people who need to be held to account are precisely the people who opportunistically lead everybody else into the dream world. Now, the trouble with The Hague, and this is breaking news, of the last 6 months is that tragically, catastrophically, a series of decisions are coming down from the appeals court, which are precisely releasing everybody, all those people. The problem with war crimes tribunals is that, by definition, the people who ordered the killing didn't do the killing themselves. The people who did the killing were ordered to do it. And for 20 years now, through incredible laborious efforts, there has been a doctrine of command responsibility, which you no longer needed a piece of paper where the person actually orders a person to do it. If a general, if a massacre happens here and the general was in charge of those troops, did nothing to discipline the troops, did nothing to stop it, did nothing to punish it afterwards, and had a general above him who was ordering it and so forth, you were able to say that it happened. And there are a series of catastrophic rulings coming down that is completely dismantling that structure. And so we're getting very close to the point where the whole legal operation is not going to be an option anymore. I don't know.
Wenn ich Ihre Bücher richtig gelesen habe, dann wird der
If I read your books correctly, well, you chose a metaphor, a dream metaphor, a minute ago, and actually, it's there's a twofold refraction, and it's becoming more complex in a twofold way. So, first of all, the war itself becomes a nightmare, and the second nightmare is coming home and being indicted by anti-Vietnam protesters who don't understand how you could possibly become involved in this war and become a mercenary in this war. And this is a kind of twofold nightmare, a double whammy. And what did that have for? What impact did that have on your own writing, and how far did it create obstacles for you as an artist? Are there any things which you can only narrate orally and which you can't write down, or conversely, things which you can only put down in writing you can't narrate orally?
No, I didn't. I've never had any trouble saying that I would either write it or talk about it. The problem was getting to the point where I would let it out in any way, shape, or form. Once I would own it, so to speak. In other words, it's like this happened and this is what happened. Writing it or talking about it is indifferent to me, other than that I sometimes will start to break down and cry or get really nervous when I'm talking to somebody as opposed to writing it in my office. But there were times when I was writing it that I'd have snot running out of my nose onto the keyboard because it was so traumatic in the sense of what had happened some years ago. But I don't see any difference between once you get to the point of saying that you want to get it from being a ghost out to being an ancestor, and that's just another method of doing it. I wanted to go back a little bit to this idea of perpetrators and victims and this sort of thing. I think that there's a genetic component in us that we are, to defend our tribe. And the concept of what constitutes my tribe intellectually should be the whole world. I mean, we should all be one people. But genetically, it's probably about 40 people. I mean, I think that that's the way we evolved. And one of the things that I think is really important to understand is this idea about how do ordinary people end up killing other people. Ordinary 19-year-olds, they're brought up in a Judeo-Christian culture, thou shalt not kill, their entire life. They're told that you can't do that, you shouldn't do that. And then they're drafted. And I wanted to say that in the Vietnam War, a large number of the people there had seriously difficult choices. Yes, they could have left the country and gone to Sweden, but come on, most 18 and 19-year-olds don't want to leave home or go to jail. And so then they're not sure that they're not being told that. I can remember arguing with friends of mine in college, and I remember saying, well, but an American president wouldn't lie to Americans. Well, I mean, that's a joke today, but in 1968, it was like, I believed that. And so,
Another point to make, by the way, is that although we are all-volunteer, quote-unquote, army today, they're not volunteering. They have no other choice.
Yeah,
It's an economic. The people who, quote, volunteer for the military today are people who have literally no other economic choice.
Well,
in many cases.
they're I mean, they can work at Starbucks or flip burgers. I mean, so I mean, there is choice, but but and a lot of them
They can't make enough to get off welfare working
to
at
defend them. I
Starbucks.
think a lot of them make it out of ideas of patriotism and ideas of, I wonder if I can do it. I mean, all these sort of things that 18 and 19-year-olds get involved with. And I was one of them. But I want to go back to this thing about, so how does the ordinary person do it when somebody causes fear to happen? I mean, in my book Matterhorn, I talk about it. The black kids and white kids got along in the bush just fine. They had to. They covered each other's back. They became friends. They come back to the rear where civilization is. And suddenly there's tension. Now, if you're the only white kid with a bunch of black friends even, you're going to go to the white side. You're simply not going to stay there, because when it starts, the shit starts to fly, you're dead. So suddenly then you have these two groups. And then what happens is that I think it's human nature that I can't kill another person, but I can kill an animal. And so there's a sort of a switch that gets flipped. And we use names all the time, nigger, towelhead, gook. I mean, God, we've had names like this, 50,000 years of it. And it's a way of saying that this animal over here is trying to kill me, and he's trying to kill my friends, and I can kill an animal. So then I'm not violating this Judeo-Christian law of thou shalt not kill. The problem is you don't have enough psychological sophistication to make sure that someone doesn't get out of that. And I have a really good example of that. And it's, I had a couple of kids, and they were kids. Both of these kids were 18, and we had been in a very long fight, and several of their friends died. And we had bodies of NVA soldiers just below our fighting holes. And they went down and cut off some ears, and they stuck them in their helmets. And as far as they were concerned, it was like I got a letter in track or football. I mean, they didn't think any further than that. They weren't sort of trying to be horrible, mutilating bodies. They just put them in their helmet like that. Well, I said, look, you can't do this. It's just not done. They killed, I know they killed your friends, but you killed their friends, And so I want you to take the ears back, and I want you to bury the bodies. And this was not trivial, because we were still getting shot at. It was very desultory. I mean, an occasional sniper was shooting at us. But you want me to go? I said, go down, and we're going to bury those bodies. So it's hard work. You have to dig a hole and everything. They both started crying. Suddenly, it wasn't a gook. It was a human being. They both started crying. And it's a switch again, see? And we just have to become more and more conscious of this, what I call just this psychological, and Carl Jung identifies, it's called casting shadows. It's your dark side. It's that fear of the other. It's our tribe against everybody else. And it's so easy to trigger. It's so easy to trigger because it's genetic. And how do you overcome genetic stuff? You have to be really conscious. So what we're dealing with here is a raising consciousness. And if there's ever anything that is slow, it's raising consciousness.
Could the military afford, as part of basic training, to raise consciousness in that way?
Yeah, I think that, people ask me that. People are these hard old crusty people, or the sort of like anything goes in warfare kinds of, real politic tough guy nonsense. Look, I think, could easily tell people in training that this is what's going to happen to you. Believe me, the minute somebody starts shooting at you, you'll turn them into an animal, and you'll save yourself and your friends. It'll be just like that. But if you are aware that this is what you've done, then the odds of a massacre, of a My Lai happening, because you don't get out of the mode. I remember reading about it. They said, we were just killing vermin. That was the word that was used, was vermin. Well, they had completely pseudo-speciated everybody in that village. And because they didn't flip out of it. If they'd been told ahead of time, or if their sergeants or their lieutenants had been told ahead of time, this is a psychological
Or their
mechanism.
president.
Or their president, yeah, exactly. Warfare would be even less atrocious than it is now. I think we can make progress. I think we can. And I don't think in any way that, you know, the U.S. Marines would be less effective if they learned this. I guess they wouldn't. They would be just fine.
Damit verbindet sich.
Which brings me to the question of the form you select. As Lawson Breschler said about himself, he is a passionate non-fiction writer, which is also something which you can read if you read Vermeer in Bosnia. You say you can't write fiction, the world is so dense, so there's no room for fiction. You, however, decided to write a novel first, and you also said the first attempt that you did was an attempt to write it in first person. Matterhorn is a third person narrative. Why was it important to switch the person from the first to the third? Which goes along with the opportunity, the enemy, the verbants which you described, to give them a face, to rehumanize them by telling their stories in a novel in a different way, in contrast to documentary text, for example.
Yes. Well, the reason that I switched is because I was very much trying to show the reader the context that my characters, that were my principal characters, Win and the principal character, Melis. And in order to do that, I had to be able to go away from the jungle and get into the headquarters. I had to be able to get into the heads of the black radicals. I had to do that. And if it was first person fiction, it would just be this. I mean, all you would see would be the jungle and the firefights. And I'm going like, that to me wasn't what I was trying to get at. I was trying to get at a lot larger pictures, so I had to expand it. Now, as far as writing a novel where we have, you know, equal weight to the Vietnamese side, it becomes, for a novelist, it becomes just very difficult because it's like, where's the narrative thread? I mean, pretty soon you're sort of, I've got 800 characters and, you know, half of them are Vietnamese and I don't even speak their language. And so at some point, just your ability as a novelist, I mean, even Tolstoy only looked at Napoleon through Prince Andrei's eyes. You know, he never got into Napoleon and figured out, well, what's the psychology of Napoleon? I mean, that would have been, you know, a lot of chapters. So fiction is limited, you know, because you have to keep the reader reading. It's no different than journalism.
By the way, I think you'd probably agree if you've read it, that an astonishing fictional achievement in that regard is The Killer Angels by Michael Shara, which if you haven't read it, it's one of the most amazing books I've ever read. It was published in 1974. It was a novel of Gettysburg with 43 separate voices. Mm-hmm. All of them made real on all sides, blacks, whites, Confederates, you know, and so forth and so on. It's very much the American Iliad in a way. Published in 1974 to absolutely zero reception because nobody wanted to read war stories at that point. It even got the Pulitzer Prize, but nothing. Yeah. But The Killer Angels by Michael Shara, that's an amazing instance of that. But coming back to nonfiction, it's interesting you say that about first and third person. Something I am adamant about is always using first person in my writing. And not out of megalomania, but out of modesty. Mm-hmm. This is my best effort, you know, and it's part of what drives me crazy about, you know, the objective narrator in standard journalism, no, it's just you're doing the best you can. I very, very much believe in fairness and accuracy, but I don't believe in omniscience or objectivity. And so what is always faced in I think, and by the way, that Peter, that's why I think that your book is so successful, although you may have been backed into having to use yourself as the narrator, but that's the point. It's the and it's not out of vanity, it's out of almost the opposite of vanity. out of fallibility. But it is true. I mean, I am in awe of people who can write fiction because I can't do it. But having said that, it seems to me that it's of the essence of nonfiction that it be narrative, that it be storytelling, ever more complicated as you can get it, and still keep it from falling apart in your hands. But storytelling. That's what we are.
Do you have to sort of self-select in terms of what you're going to write about? Because the New Yorker just won't publish it. You know that ahead of time?
Well, I mean, I quit at a certain point over that, and so I have other places I have to write for, and then there's places I just write for the drawer. I do a lot of that.
Yeah.
Again, the challenge for me repeatedly in this part of my work is finding deceptively familiar genres for people, and then being able to sneak stuff in. There was a point where I was trying to write about torture in Latin America, something that the United States was deeply involved with and which we were in deep denial of. I mean, there was absolutely no kind of sense of it. And I was very, very lucky. I came upon these caper stories. I have a book of mine, it's called A Miracle, a Universe, settling accounts with torturers. And I came, especially in one case, about, it's like Ocean's 11. It's a story of, it's kind of a cross between Missing and Ocean's 11. It's a story of a group of torture victims who embark on an incredibly dangerous, non-violent, 5-year-long plot. At any moment they could have been caught and all strung up to get even with their torturers in a nonviolent way and succeed. It's a kind of crazy genre piece, of these. It's just like Ocean's 11 in a way. But the point is, at a certain point, you can then suddenly say, you can have a trapdoor which opens out onto the torture and so forth. You don't start with the torture. And by the way, in a piece that was 90 pages long, I had 2 pages of torture. Mm-hmm. Frankly, the less you have, the better, because people can imagine much, much worse if you do it artfully.
Right.
Then
it becomes like the 97th YouTube picture of a smart bomb.
You want when it hits.
You really want to.
You want to have the San Francisco earthquake moment, and but you also don't lead with it. You find a way of getting people. It was literally a thriller, and it was at the point I just stopped it at the point where you really were eager to find out what happened, and now you're going to have 2 pages of what you've been involved in.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that it's going to always be thus? I mean, in fact, the only way that we're ever going to be able to narrate war is to, sugarcoat the pill and have them swallowed on page 19. It might just be that we're just up against human nature, and we just have to sort of accept that.
I don't see that as necessarily a negative thing. I mean, I don't think that. I don't think I can understand the truth about what you're thinking about me right now. Mm-hmm. Let alone, I don't think we live in that kind of truth all the time. We can't live as authentic creatures continuously, but we can provoke authenticity in small moments, and they can be transformative, I hope.
Yeah.
So you're both advocating for the art of leaving things out. You were forced to leave things out. I guess the manuscript you handed in comprised 800 pages or so, and the editor recommended to you to cut it down to 600, which was painful. How did you make your decision what you wanted to leave aside?
I had this wonderful editor, Jofi Ferrari Adler. He wrote me a letter when Grove first took on the work, and said it was just several paragraphs of praise. Those are going to be a classic. I'm nervous. I don't really want to. I'm really scared about working on this. And then the last sentence was, "This will be the last nice thing you hear from me." And believe me, he would do things like take the page and he would go, "Ick! This makes me puke." And then he'd say, "You fix it." There was never any sort of, and I would just go like, Then I'd have to sort of decide whether I was going to fight him or whether, he would accept it. And I got a spreadsheet out, and I said I'm going to have to cut 20%, so I want to cut it more in the beginning and less in the end, so I'm going to have a goal. And every chapter I had exactly how many words I started with and what the goal was. And if I didn't make the goal, I went back, and it was a discipline. I just kept going back and back until I finally got it cut down to where I was supposed to go, and then I'd go on to the next chapter.
There's a great line of William Matthews, the poet, that revision isn't cleaning up after the party, revision is the party.
That's right.
And by the way, if you're working with a good editor, it really is.
90% of writing is revision. I mean, the first draft's the honeymoon. I mean, the rest of it's the marriage.
I think it's a perfect closing statement for tonight. Thank you all for listening.